At my wedding reception, my mother-in-law, Diane, took the microphone and announced, "I cancelled your honeymoon. My son should spend that money on me." I laughed at first, thinking it was a joke, but then I checked my bank account and saw it was empty. My husband's next words made her regret everything. I knew Diane didn't like me, but I never thought she'd ruin my marriage before it even started. It was my wedding day, one of the happiest days of my life, until she grabbed the mic and made an announcement that shocked everyone. I still remember her smirk, like she enjoyed causing trouble. She tapped the mic, got everyone's attention, and said in a smug tone, "I have a surprise for the bride and groom. I cancelled their honeymoon because my son deserves better. Why waste money on a trip when he has responsibilities? That money should go to family, to me." The room went silent. I laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke, but she kept talking. She looked right at me, her smile growing wider. I felt sick. I glanced at my husband, Jake, expecting him to be as shocked as I was, but he just stared at his mother, his jaw tight and his hands gripping the table. I knew then this wasn't a joke. My heart raced. I grabbed my phone under the table and checked my bank account. My hands shook as I logged in. The honeymoon fund was gone, every single dollar. The money we saved, the wedding gifts, all of it was gone. My vision blurred, and my hands turned cold. I whispered to Jake, "Tell me this isn't real." He checked his account and said, "My account is empty too." Diane stood there, waiting for applause like she'd done something great. I wanted to scream or throw my drink at her, but before I could react, Jake stood up. What he said next made Diane regret everything. I felt the blood drain from my face, my hands were icy, and my stomach twisted. Our honeymoon fund, thousands of dollars, was gone. Jake gripped his phone so hard I thought it might break. His face was unreadable, but his silence sent chills down my spine. Diane stood there, basking in the attention. She looked proud of herself. Then Jake stood up, and the way he looked at her, I'd never seen him like that before. His jaw was clenched, and his expression was sharp. "Mom," he said calmly, "what did you do?" Diane rolled her eyes. "Stop being dramatic. I moved the money where it belongs. You're married now. It's time to grow up and take care of your family, me." She smiled like she expected him to thank her. Jake took a deep breath, his hands shaking. "Where's the money, Mom?" I already knew the answer. She sighed and said loudly, "I put it in my account. I needed it for important things." The nerve of her. Guests started whispering. Some gasped. My friends looked at me, concerned. My maid of honor, Sarah, was in shock. I clenched my fists so hard my nails dug into my palms. "You stole our honeymoon money," I said, my voice shaking. Diane laughed. "Stole? Don't be dramatic. You're married now. That money should go to your husband's responsibilities, like supporting his mother. I raised him. I deserve it." I was so angry I could barely breathe. Jake, however, stayed calm. He sat down, leaned forward, and said, "Mom, tell me exactly what you spent our money on." Diane smiled like she'd won. "Well, I paid off some credit card bills, put a deposit on a new car, that luxury SUV I've wanted, and booked myself a cruise. I even got the penthouse suite." She said it so casually, like stealing our honeymoon was no big deal. Jake exhaled and smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind of smile that meant trouble. "That's great, Mom, really great." Diane hesitated. "What do you mean?" Jake leaned forward. "It's great you spent money that wasn't yours, because now you've committed fraud." He pulled out his phone and called the bank. "Hi, I'd like to report fraudulent activity on my account." Diane's smirk disappeared. "Jake, what are you doing?" Jake ignored her. "Yes, I'd like to dispute unauthorized transfers. I know who did it, my mother. Here's her name and account number." Diane jumped up. "Jake, stop, you can't do this." "Oh, I can," Jake said, still smiling. "You're not on my account, Mom, you stole my money, and banks don't like fraud." Diane's face turned red. Guests were staring, some even recording. Jake added, "I'll also call the cruise line. You booked that trip with stolen money." Diane gasped. "Jake, I'm your mother, you wouldn't." "I would," Jake said. The room was silent. Diane looked around, realizing no one was on her side. She'd completely screwed herself. Jake turned to me, took my hand, and smiled. Then he looked back at Diane. "By the way, Mom, remember that prenup you told me not to sign? The one you called a waste of time?" Diane froze. "What about it?" Jake grinned. "I signed it. One of the conditions is that our accounts stay separate. So, you didn't just steal from me, you stole from my wife." Diane's face went pale. She looked around, panicking. "Jake, sweetheart, let's not overreact. But Jake was done. He put the bank rep on speaker. Sir, we've flagged the unauthorized transfers. We'll reverse the charges and notify authorities. Legal action may be taken. Diane screamed. No, Jake, fix this. Jake just smiled. You did this to yourself, Mom. I'll make sure you don't get arrested, yet, Jake said with a smirk. But the money? That's gone. You won't see a single cent of it. I watched as Diane's face turned red with anger, but what she did next shocked everyone. With a crazy look in her eyes, she turned to me and yelled, "This is your fault. You turned my son against me. He would never do this before you came along." I stayed calm and said, "I didn't make you steal from us. You did that on your own." Diane looked around the room, hoping someone would support her, but everyone just stared at her in disgust. Then, suddenly, she smiled, a creepy, slow smile. "Fine," she said sweetly, "if I can't have the money, neither can you." Before I could stop her, she grabbed her phone and started typing quickly. I stepped closer, my heart racing. "What are you doing?" Diane grinned. "Just making a phone call," she said. "I might not have access to your bank accounts anymore, but I still have tricks." She called the bank and said in a fake sweet voice, "Hi, this is Diane. I need to report a stolen credit card." My stomach sank. I knew what she was doing. She was trying to freeze our accounts by lying about fraud. That would stop us from getting our honeymoon money back. I shouted, "You psycho!" But Jake was faster. He grabbed the phone and put it on speaker. The bank rep said, "Ma'am, you're reporting a stolen card. Can you confirm the account holder's name?" Diane hesitated. She looked at me, then at Jake. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead, Mom, tell them whose account you're reporting." Diane swallowed hard. It's my son's account." The bank rep cut her off. "Ma'am, unless you're the account holder, you can't report fraud. False reports can lead to legal consequences." Diane's face fell. She looked around the room, realizing she'd made things worse. Jake just laughed, a slow, proud laugh. "Oh, Mom," he said, shaking his head, "you just can't help yourself, can you?" Diane's face turned red. She was shaking. Before she could say anything, her phone buzzed. She looked at it and went pale. Jake smirked. "That the bank?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to, because a family friend, who happened to be a lawyer, stood up and said, "Diane, you know I'm a lawyer, right? What you just did was attempted fraud. You did it in front of 50 people. People started whispering. Some nodded in agreement. Diane stepped back, panicking. I wasn't." The lawyer cut her off. "Save it. You might want to fix this before it gets worse." Diane turned to Jake, pleading, "Jake, you're not really going to let them do this to me, are you?" Jake looked at her for a long moment, then smiled. "You did this to yourself." Diane cried, "Jake, please." But Jake just shrugged. "Enjoy your new vacation, Mom. It might not be a cruise, but jail cells have a nice view." Diane's face crumpled. She finally realized she had lost. She stood there, frozen. Her face was pale, and her hands were shaking. She had lost control, but she wasn't done. "Oh, come on," she said, forcing a laugh. "This is ridiculous. Are you really going to ruin your wedding day over a little misunderstanding?" I'd had enough. I stepped forward and said, "A misunderstanding? You stole our honeymoon money, spent it on yourself, and then tried to commit fraud in front of everyone. That's not a misunderstanding, that's a crime." Diane's fake smile twitched. I wasn't finished. "You act like we owe you something, like your son's money is yours. But guess what, Diane? It's not." Some guests clapped. Diane glared at them, but she wasn't just losing control of the night, she was losing her son. Jake said, "Mom, it's time I tell you something I've been holding back. I've been done with you for a long time. I only stayed in touch because I thought you could change, but you can't. After tonight, I'm cutting you off." Diane's eyes widened. "You don't mean that." Jake said firmly, "I do." Diane gasped like she'd been slapped. The room was silent. Jake took my hand, kissed it, and said to Diane, "You took our money, now I'm taking something from you." Diane asked, "What?" "You don't have a son anymore." People gasped. Diane shook. "You don't mean that," she whispered. Jake didn't back down. "I do. No calls, no visits, no texts. If you try to contact me or my wife, I'll get a restraining order." Diane panicked. "No, Jake, you can't do this. I'm your mother, I raised you." Jake said coldly, "And you just showed me what kind of mother you are." Diane lost it. She screamed, a loud, angry scream, and stomped her foot like a child throwing a tantrum. "You ungrateful." Jake grabbed my hand and said, "Come on, let's enjoy the rest of our wedding." We walked away, leaving Diane humiliated and alone. The next day, the bank reversed the transactions. Every dollar Diane stole was returned to us. Her car deposit was cancelled, her cruise was gone, and her accounts were frozen. The bank flagged her for fraud, and she couldn't touch her money for weeks. The police even warned her that further theft would lead to charges. She became an outcast. Friends and family cut her off, even some relatives disowned her. But the final blow? 3 months later, Jake and I went on our honeymoon, a first-class trip to Greece, paid for by wedding guests who hated Diane so much they sent us extra money just to spite her. We posted photos, and Diane saw every one. According to Jake's cousin, she cried for weeks. Diane lost everything, her son, her reputation, and her control, and she did it to herself. Jake and I, on the other hand, are happier than ever. We're building a life free from her toxicity, and we have no regrets, because the best revenge is living well. And Diane? She'll have to live with the consequences of her actions, forever.